Good morning, this is Rashane Jones from Azenquor Tuts, and today we're going to be looking at Blender's interface and how to use the navigation. So if you're a beginner, this tutorial is definitely for you. So when we open up Blender, we're going to get the splash screen, and I'm currently using Blender 2.74. I've gotten this off the Graphic All website. I'm going to post a link down below, which posts daily builds of different open source software. And this happens to be one I kind of got before the official release. Alright, so let's start again. So let's close the splash screen, hitting the escape button, and just carry through the navigation. Now, if you're the first time user of Blender, you're going to want to work with what you have. So in the case where some laptops aren't built with numpads, and sometimes you guys don't have mouses, and maybe your mouses sometimes they don't have the third wheel. Alright, so we're going to just go to File. First of all, set up our user preferences. Now, you open up user preferences, it's going to show you different things for you: interface, editing, input, add-ons, themes, file, and system. Now, going to the input part, we're going to look at the presets. Now, if you've been using 3D Max Maya before, you can actually click on those. They're going to set up the shortcuts and the keys based on those specifications. But as you can see here, currently I'm not using my mouse, so I've enabled third button mouse, and that allows me to hit the Alt key and hold it while using left mouse button click in order to do what the third wheel would do. Then you also have continuous grab, which allows you to do manipulations even when you drag it outside the 3D window. Now you can choose to select with right click or left click. Blender by default gives you the right click as your select, which some people aren't too accustomed to the first time they're using it, but I think you should probably just leave it there so it'll catch on. Now, something to note: if you're using the continuous grab, it doesn't work with the left mouse select option. You can set your double click speed. If you don't have a numpad, you can use your main 1 to 0 keys as your numpad. So those of you who have your laptops without a numpad, I mean, you could always buy a numpad separate. But if you can't bother with that, what you can probably do is just simply enable mouse numpad. Now, my laptop is built with a numpad, so I don't need that. Now you have different orbit styles. You have the turntable and trackball style. Turntable is by default. You can just use a turntable rotation, while trackball, just imagine as though you were using a trackball to move around the scene. And then you have different zoom styles. You have the dolly cam, and you have the scale / continue. Now I'm going to ask you to pardon whatever dogs are barking outside. I live in a very doggy environment, and my neighbor's dogs sometimes flare up. Now you can choose how you want your navigation to work. If you want to be a walk around or a fly around, right? So if you decide to do a view navigation, you can choose whether or not you want it to do that, and you can set those up. Now there's a few more options. Now if you're really into this and you want to set up shortcuts for everything, you can always click on the different areas here, or different types of inputs, and just set them up. But for that, we're pretty much done. And if you are okay with these settings, go to Save User Preferences and hit Save User Preferences. But we're not done as yet. Now you have a few add-ons if you want to put into Blender a few additional features that typically aren't enabled. You can always go through them, and there's quite a bit of them. If we look through here, I'm currently using what they call screencast keys, where when I click or press a button, you can see whatever keys I'm pressing. So that is that part here. So we're just going to look through them. You can see the ones that are enabled versus the ones that are not enabled. And if you want to look at the different categories of add-ons, you can always do that. So that would be for animation, development, game cycle, meshes. If you want to create additional meshes, or if you want to look at what the testing ones are, you can always play with those. Now if you see these little icons, it means that they're in the development phase and probably not completely stable as yet. But you can always check those out. Now let's continue. Now, different laptops are built differently, and different people have different tastes. So looking at the themes, currently we're working with a gray theme right here in the user interface. Now we have different presets that you can actually change. Mine is currently 3ds Max. You can even change it to Amaranth, back to black, right? Cool steel. Now depending on what you like, you can always use that. Or you can use Blender 2.4, the color scheme. And if you like those, when you save the user preferences, all these will be saved. Now in the file section, these are where you want to load files. So doing 3D, working with 3D, you're probably going to want to have your textures in one folder. You might want to have your sounds in one folder, and you already know where your fonts are. So rather than actually having to navigate all the time to your textures, navigate all the time to your fonts, it's easier to set them up where the file paths are, so that when you're actually using it, you can just simply load the fonts instantly. And that comes in handy if you want to do that. Now, your render output, whenever you're doing a render of scenes and animations, you might want to set a default folder for that. Otherwise, by default, if you're using Windows, it'll go in your temp folder. And for the other versions, you will find out. So there's additional options. You have your autosave feature if you want to save sessions and how often you want to do an autosave. And if you want to set your author, I should probably put mine as this, my name. Alright, just in case. Now, image editor, you can set your image editor by what you want your image editor to be by default. If you want to be GIMP or Photoshop, whichever one you're more preferable to. Personally, I'm an open source type of guy. I mean, although I own Photoshop, I do like playing around with GIMP sometimes. Alright, so we have system. Now, some of us have graphics cards, right? I have a NVIDIA GeForce, and if you have a, well, typically for now, Blender supports the NVIDIA graphics card. The ATI I'm not too sure about as yet, but there has been a few workarounds. My friend Marklen, I'm going to put his link in the video, had a workaround for his graphics card, and he kind of found it somewhere, but it's easy to just link it to him. Now, when your graphics card is there, it typically shows up in Blender. Now, if it's not loading and you know you have a graphics card that's NVIDIA, you can probably check your program settings in the NVIDIA properties and choose which programs should be using it. And then afterwards, just reset Blender, and I think it should work. And if you can't find it, well, Google it. Alright? So, once we're done, just save user preferences and exit. Now, this is your typical interface. Alright, Blender, it's interface. Now, Blender has had a few updates in the past few years, and I think they've done a pretty good job with the interface. Now, if we look over on the left side, we have our transform properties for object, right? And you also have options to create different mesh primitives and curves and lamps and other things. And you also have relations, and if you want to create groups, etc. Or animation settings, you have your physics settings, you can do a grease pencil. It all depends on what you want to do. Alright, now over here is where you'd find some of your options here. On the right side, you have your organizer. This is for the default workspace. And on the right side, just below the organizer, you have your properties for your objects. Now, each object has different properties. And if you remember, right-clicking is to select. So if I right-click on this, you'll notice that my properties change. Well, at least the latter part. Also, if I select this, my properties change for this particular object. Now, the properties here work with your rendering, your render layers, your data, your world settings, the object settings, any constraints you want to add, your modifiers for those objects. Modifiers typically work with meshes and curves, right? So you won't find them on the other ones. And then you also have your vertex data. You have also your material settings, and your textures and your physics and particle settings and physics. Apologies, I think I'm getting a cold. Alright, I forgot to mention one thing. By default, my Blender starts with the cycles render, but by default when you actually install Blender, it usually starts with the Blender render, which is another render engine, the internal render engine for Blender. And you can choose which one you want. For the purposes of this tutorial, we'll be using the cycles render as we go on, but there will be a few cases where I'll use the Blender render just to see what the different results are. It all depends on how you use both of them, because both of them can be effective. One might be more easier to you than to me, but by experimenting, you can get more excellence to experience. Alright, so I'm going to stick with the cycles render. Now, there's something to note about Blender. If you look at these panels, none of them overlap, and that was done because a lot of software have overlapping windows, and I don't think Blender wanted that to happen in theirs when they were developing it. Now, you'll notice that there's a plus button over here. This gives you some additional properties for different things like transforming location. It all depends on the object, and the grease pencil is there as well. And you can do things with the 3D cursors to set the location and all those things. And it tells you which item you have, display options, shading, motion tracking, etc. Even more properties. So looking at cycles right there. If you want to bring that off or remove it, you can either drag it over, right, or you can press N, and you can see the shortcut pops up over here because my screencast keys are on. Right. Now you notice some diagonal lines at the top part. What that does, it enables you to split your views. So if, for instance, currently we're in the 3D view, and you can tell by this little icon here, and you'll see another set of diagonal lines. Wherever you see the diagonal lines, you are able to add more windows, more panels. But currently in our default interface or default workspace is what we have. If we change through the different interfaces, you'll see for 3D full view we have just the 3D area. For animation we have something completely different. For compositing, which we'll be getting into eventually, you have something completely different. Game logic, you can do the game logic because games can be built with Blender. For motion tracking, something else. And you get the idea. Scripting, if you're going to get into the whole programming aspect of it. UV editing and video editing. A whole bunch of different options. Alright. So going back to the default. And if for any reason you want to create your own layout, you can always just manipulate what you have and then save it by hitting the plus button and just saving it to new. So what I'll be doing is, for instance, now when it comes to 3D, a lot of people want to have multiple views of their object in the interface. And so one of the easiest way to do it is to click on this and drag it out. Right? If you drag it to the left, it's going to come out on the right side. And additionally, I'm going to remove this, and I just hit T on my keyboard. Now note, wherever your mouse is, that's where the shortcut is going to be applied. So if I hit T here, it's going to apply it to this particular window. If I came over here and I was trying to close this window, it won't work. So whatever shortcut you're intending to use, make sure your mouse is hovering in that area. So currently we have the two same views, and I can use because I don't have my mouse, I'm going to hold Alt and click on my left click, and you can see right there on the little preview I have my middle mouse button clicked. Now you can simply do that to swivel around your interface. Just get used to it. If you want to carry it up, it's a simple carry it up like so. Just look below it. Right? And this is what they call the user perspective view. And currently you're also seeing the X, Y, Z axes. And here you have your transform manipulator on there that shows that interface is we can transform it in those directions. So I'm just covering the interface area. I'm not going to go into manipulations or anything, but if you want to zoom in, you can press plus on your numpad, or if you don't have a numpad, you can always hit Control plus on your alphanumeric keys. Right? If for any reason you want to do the same options and you want to go the long route, you can always hit view, and there are options here that allow you to zoom in, zoom out, change the perspective. So you have here zoom in, it only goes by 1, so you won't really see it. If you want to fly into the selected object, it's hitting the delete key or the period key on the numpad, and it flies in. You'll notice that even though this scene isn't doing anything, this scene is changing, but this one isn't because I'm working with this scene. So if, for instance, I wanted this to be user perspective and I wanted a camera view over here, I can hit 0 on my numpad. Now, if you want to find out all the shortcuts, I suggest going to Blender Guru's website. Andrew Price has a great shortcut key set, and I'm going to put the link also below. And it kind of gives you an overall list of keys or shortcuts you want to be familiar with when you're using Blender, just to make it easier for your workflow and make it easier for you to work with. Alright, so these are the shortcuts. Get used to them, right? So this is camera perspective view, and maybe over here I want maybe a top view, and I hit numpad 7, and that gives me a top view. Now there's two types of views in 3D software. One is the perspective view, which is what we're currently seeing, and one is the orthographic view. Orthographic is a more technical view. It doesn't take into consideration distance, making things look smaller as the objects get further away. Or rather, what it does, it just gives you measurements in specific. It doesn't matter where it's positioned, it's just gonna work. So currently it's user persp. If I go to view and options here, view perspective / ortho, hit 5, you're gonna see that the perspective disappears and it just comes in as an isometric kind of a view. And if you navigate that way, it'll look like this. Look at the different views now. We have this. It disappears as it goes into the distance, but you notice just this continues. Right, so that's all a matter of that. Now, something else to note. In 3D, well, Blender has a 3D cursor. And the 3D cursor is used to position, well, you can position objects with it in a specific way, but essentially when you're using a 3D cursor, if you're creating objects, objects appear where your 3D cursor is located. Right, so if you click there and you want to create a new object, it's going to go into the little objects. Let's say you wanted to add an object. There's a whole bunch of different ways to do it. You could go to create options and create your objects. You could go to add and create your objects. You could press shift and A to create your objects. Or you could just hit spacebar if you know what you're doing and you know what objects you want. Hit spacebar, and let's say I wanted to use a UV sphere. UV sphere, and it pops up there and just click. Now that's the cool thing about Blender, is that it comes with a spacebar shortcut list, and that allows you to drop in what you want. I mean, you can't say I want to put in a rabbit, but you can say you want to put in a monkey. So I'm going to change the position again. Add me a monkey, and that's Susan. Most 3D software come with a teapot. I think that's a Utah teapot. And Blender comes with Suzanne, which is a monkey head. Right? So that's it for today's navigation. If you have any questions, just post them in the comment box below, and I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Onward to excellence. God bless.